Hello again, everyone. I'm Jam. I'll be moderating today's event. We are now officially starting the webinar. So I'm seeing some people joining from different parts of the Philippines. I'm seeing people joining from South Cotabato. I'm also seeing people from General Santos. And of course, our speakers are joining from um, California and Australia, respectively. So before anything else, we'd like to establish some house rules to make sure that the event flows properly. Since this is a webinar about politics, economics, and philosophy, we understand that sometimes passions may run high. However, we still implore everyone to be civil and respectful at all times. So just let me just read some house rules for you. So number one, strictly no spamming at any time. Number two is remember to be polite at all times. Number three is pay attention to the speaker and the presentation. Number four is if you need to ask any questions to the speakers, we'll have a question and answer portion after each presentation. And number five is if at any time you wish to enter your questions, you may do so in the chat box. We'd like to thank our partners and sponsors that made this event possible. First, we'd like to thank the Institute of Economic Affairs in London for making this event a reality. IEA is committed to spreading ideas about liberalism, and you may access their free primers online, which we'll be linking in the comment box. The primers that they have discuss a wide range of topics, from political thinkers to liberalism to economics and more. This webinar is also in partnership with the Philosophical Society of UPLB, the Mindanao State University Economic Society, MSU Marawi Junior Economic Society, the Liberal Arts Students Organization at Jose Rizal University, and the University of Asia and the Pacific, Polis. This webinar is also brought to you by the Bicol University Economic Society. And finally, we would also like to say special thanks to the Economics Research Society, SSC Manila Economics Organization, PUP Samahan ng mga Mag-aaral ng Kasaysayan, and the UP Agribusiness Society. In examining the evolution of and political ideologies, we turn our attention to a pivotal moment in modern history. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1992, political scientist and economist Francis Fukuyama announced the end of history. Liberalism, according to Fukuyama, particularly its cherished notions of individual liberty, equality, democratic institutions, and free market capitalism, have prevailed against competing ideologies like socialism and fascism that brought the world into devastating conflicts. 6 years to Fukuyama's bold declaration, the Philippines stunned the world with its democratic revolution that peacefully toppled decades of dictatorship. Yet, after just 3 decades, Fukuyama rolled back his optimism and cited some existential threats to the so-called rules-based global order. On one hand, both left and right-wing groups criticize globalization and free trade. People are forced to choose between two sides, lest they want to be deemed as siding with oppressors and traitors. Meanwhile, authoritarian states such as China and Russia are providing an alternative path to prosperity that does not necessitate liberal institutions and respect for human rights. In the Philippines in recent years, we have seen a democratic backslide, particularly in matters of press freedom, human rights, and institutional trust. Populist rhetoric effectively dismantled the EDSA narrative's explanatory power. So to this we ask, is liberalism's reign over? To begin with, do we even remember what liberalism is as a political philosophy in the system, or have we taken it for granted, akin to the air we breathe? Did it fail to deliver its promises? And finally, what can we expect from liberalism in the future? To discuss this, we have invited two distinguished speakers to share their insights to talk about liberalism, and I'm pretty sure we're all excited to hear from them. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Alexandre Lefebvre. Dr. Lefebvre is a professor of politics and philosophy at the University of Sydney who teaches and conducts research in political theory, the history of political thought, modern and contemporary French philosophy, and human rights. Having grown up in Vancouver, Canada, Dr. Lefebvre pursued his studies in the United States, earning his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University Humanities Center in 2007. Residing in Sydney, Dr. Lefebvre has spent the past decade delving into the concept that political ideas and institutions can profoundly influence ways of life. His research and publications explore this notion extensively. Dr. Lefebvre's most recent publication, Liberalism as a Way of Life, examines how liberalism permeates our values and perceptions, shaping our understanding of what is good, right, normal, and more. Dr. Lefebvre, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Jem, and it's a pleasure to meet all of you. Jem, may I share my screen in lieu of yours, or should I just... I think I can do it that way. Is this, does it work? Does it look like it should?
Yes, it works. Alex.
Perfect. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and I want to thank you for the honor and the opportunity to address the Foundation for Economic Freedom and the IAE, and on such an important topic and one so close to my heart, and I imagine many of your heart, the meaning and future of liberalism. So as Jem kindly said, I am professor of politics and philosophy at the University of Sydney, and I work on political philosophy. And as he also kindly said, I have a book that is coming out in just a few days. I'm very excited about that, called Liberalism as a Way of Life. Here it is. Jem talked about liberalism as the air we breathe. My metaphor in the book is that it's the water we swim in. So I have this beach scene on the cover, but I'll say a word or two about that a little later on. So today I'm here to discuss a philosophy that lies at the heart of the mission of your institution, which is liberalism. And this is an ideology that, with its emphasis on individual freedom, on democratic governance, and economic opportunity, resonates deeply with the values of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. So now I've been given a very, if I may say, daunting and almost overwhelming brief or mission, as it were, which is to give an overview of the history and idea and also the future of liberalism, all within the constraints of half an hour. I'm going to do my very best and keep it tight. And so with your indulgence, let me dive right in, and I will, of course, field as many questions as time permits. So let me start as simply as I can. When people talk about liberalism, they talk about 1,000,001 different things. So I'll begin with very simply, and we're going to get more interesting in a moment, just with the dictionary definition of what liberalism is, just to get a point of reference in common. So liberalism, on the Oxford English Dictionary's account, is a social and political philosophy based on support for or advocacy of individual rights, civil liberties, and reform tending towards individual freedom, democracy, or social equality. Now, as a starting point, that's fine enough. But the difficulty is that the minute that we start to get into the specifics of what any of these terms really mean and what it might entail from our social and political and economic institutions, the term liberalism starts to splinter in a great many different directions. In fact, there's so much confusion about liberalism and its true meaning that the word takes on very different complexion, almost a very different meaning, depending on what country we are considering at the moment. So, for example, if you were to hop on a plane, or where Dr. Claudio is right now in the United States, liberalism nowadays if you call someone a liberal, it means, of course, that they are something like a progressive, an ideology that favors equality, progressive taxation, and is as strongly committed to protecting pronouns and identity as it is to preserving freedom of speech. But if you cross the border to Canada, where I'm from, it means something like the center party, the center ruling party. In Australia, here where I'm talking to you from, it's center-right. And if you go to France, it means an almost cruelly right-wing small government ideology. So here I just put up a picture of Biden and Macron. But what's funny is that they would both have equal reason to avoid the label of liberalism, but for almost exactly opposite reasons. So to bring a little bit of order and perspective into this discussion, I'd like to start historically, because a little history goes a long ways to explain what liberalism might mean today. And I think I hope it will shed light on what liberalism means, not simply as a political doctrine, but also as a moral one as well. So the first thing to say about liberalism is that the word and the ideology is pretty new by the standards of intellectual history. It's only 200 years old, first used in Spain in the early 1800s, and then within a decade throughout Europe. So certainly people defended ideas of freedom and of equality and of human rights long before that, but people started calling themselves liberal in a recognizably modern sense only in the 19th century. So on the one hand, it's kind of a newborn. On the other hand, liberalism is a very old word indeed, and its roots go back all the way to ancient Rome. So if I might recommend a book that I just love and that helped guide me a lot in my own thinking, It's a book published in 2018 by Princeton University Press, titled The Lost History of Liberalism by a political historian named Helena Rosenblatt. And her story begins by tracing out the roots of the word liberalism and what they might mean. And so at the root of them, you have two words, liber and an adjective and a noun, a liber and liberalis. So indicating at once a status of being free and also a quality of being generous. And I note that this idea, so we typically think today that liberalism simply means being free, personal freedom, individual rights, that kind of stuff. And I don't want to dispute that. Of course, that's true. But liberal also has another equally important word, which is to say generous, generosity. And we have that preserved right in the word liberal in English today. So here's a not very attractive picture of the great 19th century John Stuart Mill. But we have the definition of liberal here from the Oxford English Dictionary as free in giving, generous, benevolent, magnanimous, suitable for a free or noble person. And of course, that meaning is preserved like just in the way we talk today. If I ask, for example, for a liberal serving of soup, I'm asking for a big bowl of soup, right? I'm not asking for a politically progressive soup. So what Rosenblatt does in her book is she charts out how the idea of being liberal was reinvented in all of these different civilizational frameworks. So in the ancient world, especially Rome, it meant being generous to society, specifically a readiness to give one's talents, one's money, even one's life to the Republic or later to the Empire. In Christianity, in the Christian Middle Ages, it gets totally reinvented under the virtue of charity. The word liberal is used about a dozen times in the King James Bible. And then in the early modern period, particularly the Americas, the word liberal comes roaring back, typically to mean dedicating oneself to the public good of the Republic. Now, the details don't matter here, but it's this twofold quality of being free and generous that gets sort of adapted by all these different moral paradigms. Now, when we come to the 19th century, which is when liberalism is born, something fascinating happens. So 19th century liberals looked around, and this was the great question that I believe they posed. So this is a question that I think underlies all the great thinkers of the 19th century liberalism, whether we start with the French early thinkers, such as Benjamin Constant, Madame de Staël, my favorite, Alexis de Tocqueville, or we go a little later to people like John Stuart Mill. The big question they posed, I believe, is the following. How can modern subjects remain free and generous, which is to say, how can they remain liberal in the face of powerful new social forces? So what do I mean by powerful social forces? Well, there's two I have in mind. 19th century liberals were really, let me put this very plainly, 19th century liberals were deeply freaked out about the all of these new institutions, forces, movements that were arising in their day and age that thought profoundly threatened the individual well-being of ordinary people. One of those big forces was capitalism, both as something that would wreak havoc with equality and equality of opportunity, but also something that would turn individual people into really kind of, I don't know how to put this, crummy, bad human beings, people who would be really materialistic, really consumerist, wanting out of life only the next quick hit of dopamine that they can get from whatever it is in their world. So that was one big worry. It was capitalism. But the really big worry, and I want to impress this because it's not how we think today, and it's very important to the story, the really big worry that freaked out 19th century liberals was the advent of democracy. So early 19th century liberals were worried about democracy in two different respects. On the one hand, they were worried about democracy as a political kind of phenomenon, as something that always threatened with populism, that the tyranny of the majority would rear its ugly head, that you would get excessive revolutionary kind of movements like the French Jacobins. So all of that stuff freaked them out on a political level. But democracy also freaked liberals out on a cultural and psychological levels. And the worry is that they were terrified that terrified is too strong. They were strongly demoralized about the prospect that cultural power would start to be wielded by the common man, such that the tastes and desires of people would just kind of settle to this lowest common denominator. Now, I don't want to be clear, I don't think liberalism and democracy are necessarily in tension, but I do want to emphasize the fact that they initially were. And here I think is excellent proof of it. When we look at the main institutions that today we just immediately associate with liberalism, it's important to recognize that all of them are counter-majoritarian. all of them are protections in important ways against certain dangers that potentially lurk within democracy. So we have the idea of individual rights, where majorities aren't able to oppress us individuals at a fundamental level. We have the idea of division of powers, where the branches of government are divided so that it can't consolidate in one popular block. We have the idea of rule of law, which is that law applies to all groups equally, and not just all individuals equally, of course, but all groups equally, no matter who you are, where you're from. We have judicial neutrality and independence, judicial review, and then protections for tolerance and freedoms. All of these are straightforwardly counter-majoritarian institutions. So I'll revisit this point at the end, because what we call liberal democracy today is a hard-fought reconciliation between liberalism and democracy, one that took a couple of centuries to achieve. But just for right now, I'm going to park that and come back to it. I want to just stress one last time that in their origin in the 19th century, liberalism and democracy were seen, if not to contradict each other, then at any rate to be in tension. Democracy was about popular sovereignty and majority will, whereas liberalism was about individual rights and welfare. So that's the 19th century picture. What happens next? Okay, so here we get to a very complicated story of the many different versions of liberalism that have been created over 200 years. And I'm going to walk through, it was what I was asked to do, to try to provide an overview of the different meanings of liberalism. So I'm going to do that hopefully with some economy and speed, but without going too fast. But I want to introduce a metaphor first to talk about how we might think about liberalism. So a few years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting one of perhaps the great scholar of the history and political history of liberalism, Michael Frieden from Oxford University, who's written many books on this. He wrote the very short Oxford introduction on the topic of liberalism. Anyways, put it this way, he's very, very smart and knows his liberalism. And he just said, okay, Alex, at the end of the day, here's how I think about liberalism. I think about liberalism as modular furniture. And by modular furniture, I hope you know what I mean. Like when you go into a fancy, trendy design store nowadays, furniture is kind of a kind today where it's all kind of movable, especially office furniture, but you can say like these little bits that you can rearrange the room as you need, as the situation demands. So you roll out one piece, you put another at the center. And what Frieden was trying to get at is that liberalism has so many key concepts in its repertoire, things like freedom, fairness, tolerance, and the list goes on. And what he wanted to say is that the history of liberalism can be understood as one of those things moving to the center of the room for a certain moment of time, and all of the other aspects of liberalism would sort of accommodate itself to that big thing in the middle. So that's what I mean by modular furniture. It's like, let's say freedom is the big concept of liberalism that's important at a particular moment in time. Then the freedom couch, as it were, moves to the center of the room, and then you put the chairs around it, and you put the TV over here. That's the idea. So it keeps on shifting in that way. And what I want to suggest is that there's 5 different, to continue my metaphor, furniture stagings of liberalism, 5 different arrangements that the room of liberalism has taken over the last century and a half. I'm going to cover them off quickly enough. But briefly, they are liberalism as restrained government power, liberalism as free markets and economic interactions. Next, a theory of liberalism as human progress, or if you like, human perfectibility. Next, we have liberalism as equality and state-regulated welfare. And last, liberalism as pluralism and tolerance. So again, the way I'm trying to understand and present this to you is that at any one period of time, one of these sort of becomes more prominent than the others and moves to the center of the room. It doesn't totally negate or crowd out the others, but it becomes the central kind of vibe, let's say, of the liberalism of the time. I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't in the questions, I'm happy to address it. So the first is, I think this is going to be probably the most familiar to us, is the view of liberalism as restrained government power. And here, one way to put this, I think is very interesting, is today we tend to think of liberals, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, as pretty like optimistic, chipper kind of people, like people who think human beings are basically good and they have a progressive view of history and et cetera, et cetera. That's cool, that's fine. But if you go back to the originators of liberalism, that is not the vibe at all. The founders of liberalism were deeply misanthropic individuals, people who really distrusted human beings, that was worried about how the powerful would behave and couldn't count on nice, enlightened rulers to just be nice and enlightened. And so what early liberals did with their suspicion of human beings and their suspicion of the powerful is that they created a discourse, liberalism, as in order to try to restrain government power and to scatter government power so it couldn't be consolidated in one site and then weigh on harmless individuals or defenseless individuals like you and me. And so here we have the idea of liberalism as restrained government power. The idea is to limit state power, principally through the institution of law. So here you have rule of law, individual rights, all of that, which is kind of a shield. And then you have some authors that I'm sure you are familiar with that sort of developed this initially. Locke, the British version, Montesquieu, the French, and then the American founding fathers are very much in this tradition. And there's modern versions too, more contemporary ones. The next one, which I'm sure is quite dear to the mission of this institution, is the idea of liberalism as free markets and economic interactions. So this strand of liberalism is all about unleashing and enabling activity through free markets and economic interactions. So here government has an important role to play still, but the role changes significantly. Now it's not so much to protect people from power. Now liberalism is not about protecting people from power, but the role of government in this liberal imagination is to ensure the smooth running of markets and the preservation in particular of free and fair markets. So here, liberty of liberalism stands for economic freedom, such as the freedom to contract and the freedom to own and dispense and alienate property. And to be clear, it's easy to think that this strand of liberalism is like about selfishness, about egoism, about consumerism, all that stuff. And it can be, don't get me wrong, but that's not how it was originally seen. And that's not how it is at its morally best version. So lots of great thinkers, early thinkers like Montesquieu, like David Hume and Adam Smith, held that this idea of a commercial liberal society was this giant step forward in human progress. Because for the first time in basically human society, as they saw it, the energy and dynamism of ambitious people was directed towards useful and reciprocal undertakings in the marketplace. And so commerce replaced war as the kind of thing that ambitious people seek to do and dominate in. And say what you like about commerce being kind of gross or bad or something like that, it's certainly better than war. And that's how they saw it. Moreover, if you go look to later 20th century thinkers like Friedrich Hayek, for example, he argued, and many others did, that the moral ideal of fairness was best achieved by market interactions rather than any kind of central planning or price setting on the part of governments. So this kind of, I'm kind of speaking too quickly here, but the idea here is that this free market business isn't just about making money. There's also an important moral vision that is behind it that is committed in its way to ideals of individual freedom and also of fairness understood in a particular kind of way. Next, we have the strain of liberalism as human progress. And the idea here is that, sure, individuals are free to pursue their own conception of the good life. Good for them, go for it. But the state and culture more widely has to provide the right institutions for individuals to become the best possible version of themselves so that we don't develop ourselves in the kind of laziest, easiest, unfulfilling kind of ways. So we don't sit around playing video games or I don't know what all day. And so this is a version of liberalism that has fallen today out of fashion, but I think it's important. And I mention it here. It's sometimes called perfectionist liberalism, but the idea is that there would be publicly funded institutions to try to ensure individuals become the best version of themselves they can be. And so we have institutions here like schools, universities, cultural industries, and more. And the reason why this one has fallen out of fashion, of course, is that it is in tension with pluralism and tolerance, in that the state here is very close to recommending a certain way of living that can be at odds with the idea that liberalism has of just letting individuals do their own thing. Next, we have a vision of liberalism that's very deeply familiar to all of us, which is liberalism as equality and state-regulated welfare. The idea here is that liberalism is not just about liberty, but about the fair value or the fair worth of liberties. And so, for example, freedom of speech doesn't mean much if you're utterly uneducated. So here the idea is that the liberal state steps in to guarantee what capitalism cannot, which is to say fair opportunities for all citizens through such means as regulation, redistributive taxation, and more. And so here we have the great 20th century author here would be John Rawls, but we have Thomas Piketty more recently, and then we have kind of like the Scandinavian countries would be sort of this version. Finally, we have an idea of liberalism as human progress. Sorry, sorry, I went back, forgive me. Well, I did that one. I went backwards. So last one, finally for real, we have liberalism as pluralism and tolerance. And forgive the pictures, I just took Australian ones. You can substitute Filipino ones as fit. But the standard story of liberalism is that it grew out of the wars of religion in the 16th century, where Europe quickly realized that it was going to tear itself apart if it kept on insisting on the one true faith. Protestants and Catholics would just veer towards mutual annihilation. And so they set up a system of freedom of religion that over the centuries evolved into something more robustly moral, in the sense that not just do we tolerate or permit other people to have their own vision of the good life, we now positively affirm it and think that diversity is a strength. And so this is the kind of the keynote of many multicultural societies. So I'm going to start wrapping up here I want to talk about my book very briefly, and then I want to open up to questions. So where do we find ourselves today? So I think all of these 5 different strands that I've been talking about can be discovered in the world today and are prominent in different places, like the modular furniture metaphor I've been talking about. So in the United States, you get the kind of liberty, free-willing, libertarian stuff. You just pick your country and you can kind of see where it slants in terms of these. Now, I just have one important development to discuss, which is the topic of my book, Liberalism as a Way of Life. And it's something that I believe is a very significant development that has happened to liberalism over the last 30 to 40 years, and significant not just for liberalism, but significant for us, ordinary people like you and me, and how we live our lives. And the idea here is that particularly in secular countries where many people do not believe in religion, I know the Philippines I know it's an officially secular country, but it is strongly religious. I looked it up. I think it's 80 to 90% are religious. But in the United States, for example, 30% aren't. In Australia, it's 50%. In New Zealand, godless New Zealand, it's 70%. So more and more, as I'm sure you all know, secularism is on the rise worldwide. And the claim I make in my book is that liberalism has started to be adopted more and more as a comprehensive value system, a worldview, a way of living, if you like, a kind of religion. I don't like that word because I think it distorts what I'm trying to say, but I can kind of, as a shorthand, I can use it. And the question that I begin the book with is a very simple, very direct question. And I ask my reader, where do you get your values from? And by that question, where do you get your values from? I'm in a sense talking about your big top line moral values, but I'm really talking about just like your moral sensibility, your vibe, to use that word again. What can you point to as the source for that? Now, if you're religious, the question is easy peasy. It's just a piece of cake. You would just point to your church, your faith, your sacred text, or whatever. You just say, bang, that's where I get my values from. And you have a perfectly good answer. But for us seculars like me, people who are unchurched and who don't profess a religion, the question is really, really hard to answer. It's super basic, but it's very difficult. We don't quite know what to say. We're like, from my friends and family, or from my experience, or maybe if we want to say something very specific, from, I don't know, the films of Greta Gerwig, the novels of Jane Austen, or whatever. But there has to be some bigger thing, some bigger framework that we can point to indicate who we are deep down. And my claim, excuse me, is that liberalism does that in our world today. And so my thesis is, should this interest you? And you can ask yourself if this is true of you, is that a great many people living in Western democratic countries today are what I call liberals, quote unquote, all the way down, by which I mean that they draw their values and vibe and their sense of what is good, right, normal, outrageous, wrong, funny, worthwhile, and much more from liberalism. The idea being is that today we inhabit a culture in which liberal ideals of tolerance, of fairness, of freedom have absolutely spread from out of the political realm into culture more generally, such that it's in dating apps, it's in Netflix, it's in workplace relations and HR codes, and it's in how we parent, it's in what we watch on YouTube. All of that stuff, we're kind of like constantly sitting in this hegemonic liberal culture and acquiring it. And I'm not messing around. My thesis is pretty robust. I write last 2 lines of the book, liberalism is the source of my soul. Yeah, that's right. The wager of this book is the same is probably true of you. So that's a new take on liberalism. It's new in particular for people who consider themselves liberal. What's very interesting about our moment, our cultural moment right now, and I'm starting to wind up here, is how critics regard liberalism and what they make of it. So liberals, people who believe in liberalism, tend to think of it as a political kind of thing. But you know who doesn't think of it as a political kind of thing and who sees it as really a big cultural kind of thing? Are conservative critics of liberalism, particularly religious conservative critics of liberalism. So here is one of the most famous books published in 2018 that got all kinds of attention because it was endorsed by then President Obama. Not endorsed, but like saying, here's an interesting book over Twitter, and then it just kind of blew up, and it's inspired a whole literature and movement. But the idea is basically that. So liberalism, Patrick Deneen writes, is not merely, as is often portrayed, a narrowly political project of constitutional government and juridical defense of rights. Rather, it seeks to transform all of human life and the world. That's what I think too. I think liberalism can be, is politically valuable and can be psychologically excellent, but I do agree with the critics on the question of the scope of liberalism. Okay, so where do we find ourselves today? Now, today, liberalism suffers from two threats that interact in very complex ways. On the one hand, you have rival ideologies from non- and illiberal countries. And then on the other hand, you have dissatisfaction from within liberal democracies today. So on the one hand, you have illiberal countries and political movements are indeed on the rise. So if you want to try to put your finger on the most vibrant political movements today, they are almost all to a number illiberal. They're the ones with the most energy, the most heat, certainly getting the most press and attention. So I'm talking here about, of course, here's Putin and the Saudi crown prince pictured, but of course we could talk about the CCP and Xi Jinping. We could talk about the BJP in India with Narendra Modi, Putinism in Russia, Islamo republics in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So what to make of these regimes is something to discuss over many conversations, and it'll go on for decades in your country and mine and worldwide. My own belief is that we misrepresent and misunderstand these sorts of illiberal regimes if we think that they only rule through repression, fear, ignorance, and cruelty. I think, in fact, a great part of their power comes from promoting ways of life and worldviews that propose to displace liberalism with an alternate value system. Liberalism is good at some things, but it's not good at all things. And there are certain values that liberalism doesn't nourish that well. Things like bravery, courage, self-sacrifice, relations with nature. Liberalism doesn't do all that stuff very well. And so these other kinds of illiberal movements, whatever their crueler, meaner faces, they can make a worthwhile values-based pitch to their members. China, for instance, recently announced a model of modernization to, quote unquote, enrich the spiritual world of its people. My point is that these regimes claim to know what a life worth living is for their citizens, are confident that their vision is popularly supported, and are prepared to harness formidable persuasive and coercive powers to advance it. So that's on the one hand. That's the one threat external to liberalism, these rival ideologies and worldviews. The other, of course, as you all know, are internal threats to liberal democracy. And none better and more timely, particularly today. Great timing with this and Trump's conviction. MAGA in the United States, but all the derivative MAGA movements around the world. Now, it's often said that MAGA and similar movements, for example, in Hungary or in Turkey, are anti-democratic, or that MAGA is undemocratic. I personally, and you can push back on me in question, I'm very happy, I think that that claim that those movements are undemocratic, I think that is badly mistaken. I think these movements are, in fact, democratic in that they insist on the legitimacy of majority rule and the moral rightness of the majority, but they are, however, illiberal democratic movements. They're an attempt to downplay the liberal elements or components of the liberal democratic equation. Which brings me back to where I started. Liberalism was born shortly after democracy in the 19th century as a reaction against it and as an attempt to contain some of its dangers, as the liberals saw it. And it took decades upon decades and experiment upon experiment to get the balance right. So today we talk about liberal democracy as if these two things are like a picnic basket, like both of these things come together. They're like peaches and cream, they just work. But that little hyphen in the middle of those two terms is a tremendously hard-won achievement over 200 years. Too much liberalism without democracy can end in elitism, in technocracy, in all kinds of oligarchies, which are not only anti-democratic, but I believe are dangerously unstable since they generate popular resentment against elites. On the other hand, excuse me, it's fine. On the other hand, too much democracy without liberalism has its dangers too, which we just mentioned, populism and the threat it poses to the freedom of individuals. We need then to strike the right balance and find the appropriate hyphen between the two, and it's institutions like yours and a crowd like you that I believe will be at the forefront of this project. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your talk, for your discussion. We'll now be opening the floor to questions. You may type in your questions in the chat box, or if you want to be anonymous, you may also send me or Jamil Criado your questions. Again, if you wish to be anonymous.
I'm happy, of course, too, to just get questions face-to-face too, but whichever you prefer. The first one is, sorry, I put on my glasses. What are your thoughts on, Brave, thoughts on neoliberal? My original understanding is that it's almost synonymous with Reaganism, libertarianism, but recently it discovered a shift in how the term is used. Now it just, yeah, so I mean, my understanding, okay, great question. Neoliberalism is a very tricky thing to place, but going back to the modular furniture example, I believe neoliberalism is a version of liberalism that really puts economic freedoms at its heart, and in particular tries to downplay institutions of welfare, redistribution, and government regulation in general. So I think it's a recognizable version of liberalism. It's not the one that I champion in my book. I'm more center left than that, but I do believe it's based on notions of economic fairness, market interactions, and all that. And crucially, I think it's very interesting. I think that neoliberalism has a moral vision as well. It's not just about let's make a whole bunch of money for global corporations. I think it's a vision about individual self-determination, about the value of the individual as distinct from the collective, and about trying to release the energy of the individual back into society. That, at any rate, is how Thatcher talked about it. She was always saying the collectivist society of the UK at the time was just deeply stifling, and she wanted to try to find a way to liberate individuals from it. I don't believe that's the right way to do it, but that's the moral vision behind it, and I think we need to understand it on its own terms. If I may recommend a book to you or to whomever, on this topic. It's by a Sydney colleague of mine, just by coincidence, but it's called The Morals of the Marketplace, and it's about the moral vision of neoliberalism by the author Jessica White, W-H-Y-T-E. Okay, next question by Albert. Do you think the democratic socialists or America are, yes, well, it depends. Okay, so I think that insofar, so thank you, sorry, I'll read the question out loud. Do you think the Democratic Socialists of America or Democratic Socialists as a whole can be an ally of liberalism? I'd be interested if we could, I don't think we can, but run a poll on this question. My gut feeling is yes. I do think that so there's all kinds of works being written right now on what we might call liberal socialism, which is to say a liberalism that strongly favors fairness, but that preserves individual rights within a balance. So we have, so I would kind of be an author in that respect. Daniel Chandler just wrote a book called Free and Equal. Samuel Moyn wrote a book called Liberalism Against Itself. There's all kinds of, and there's one actually being published next year called Liberal Socialism by Matt McManus, which should be really good. So I definitely think that those two can be reconciled. I think that John Rawls, for example, who is an important thinker for me, his whole career was trying to reconcile two traditions of liberalism. On the one hand, the freewheeling American freedom stuff, and on the other hand, the fairness socialist European stuff. And he tried to bridge the two into one coherent project underwritten by the ideal of fairness. And I don't know what you think about it, but I think it was a pretty good effort to do so. So that would be my my response. Good day. What do I think? So I sort of answered this. So this is to Felmark. What is the key difference between neoliberalism and liberalism? I think the big difference is in neoliberalism is disinvestment from regulation and public supports for fairness in favor of individual freedom and market freedoms. That's the main thing. I would say government withdrawal from socialized institutions, things like medicine, healthcare, universities, parks, prisons, military, and more. In neoliberalism, you see a huge disinvestment from those things. Can push back on me on any of these answers. Good day. Okay. Now I'm at Chanel. Good day. How can we possibly attract? Oh, sorry. How can we possibly attract religious people? Okay, that's a great question. Ooh, I love that question. Very, very. So what I try to do in my book, this is what I'm not trying to. Okay. Sorry, too many things in my head right now. It's such a good question. I think liberals. Let me speak. We're all friends here. Let me speak bluntly. I think liberals suck at defending themselves. And the reason I think liberals suck at defending themselves is I think that, first of all, we go negative too much. We're always like talking about like how nasty and bad authoritarians are and populists are, and that's just not going to get anywhere. And on the other hand, I think that we talk too much about institutions, and those are super important in liberalism. But the rivals to liberalism today are things like this CCP China or Putinism, and they're not doctrines really about institutions. They're doctrines about how to live well, how to be a full and flourishing human being and country. And I think liberalism needs to start taking on its opponents on its own turf and start talking up the benefits of a liberal way of life as robustly and positively as it can. That's what I tried to do in my book, try to suggest that liberalism is not just a way of life, but that can be a really good way of life, one that is as morally serious and also as joyful as any religion. Whether or not I'm convincing, you'll have to check the book, but that's the pitch I think liberals need to make, and I tried to do my best in my book. Should I just keep on fielding these questions? How much time do I have, Jen?
Yeah, you can just keep on reading them. You still have 10 minutes.
Okay, good. Oh, perfect. Oh, okay, great. And Alex, I see your hand raised. I can come to that in a sec. So Cesar, third world countries like the Philippines struggle both in achieving economic development and erratic. Yeah, okay, right. Here we have liberals like the FEF calling for economic liberalization and liberals championing economic protectionism. This manifests in the policy debates that FES oddly with fellow liberals, like a little civil war action, maybe you're saying. So in practice, this modula is quesadilla and can be violent. That's right. That's completely actually correct. Good point. I think this tension between liberals can be a threat to long-term development and liberalism itself. I think this tension, yeah. Listen, I think that's a great question. I think that that's something I especially the first question about the Philippines, I think I'll leave to the experts. So Dr. Claudio is going to talk about that, and I would urge you to repeat the question because I think it's a good one. I'm just not very competent to answer it. The other one, I think you stressed something really intelligent that I should have mentioned in my thing, which is that the modular furniture thing sounds cute. It sounds like we're wheeling out a couch and putting in like a Chesterfield, and they're like, I don't know, something like that. And it's like, oh, fun. But you're right. These are movements that can be incommensurable with one another, anathema to one another, and can be unstable as we move from one to the other. So I don't have anything to say in reply. If you want to come in, I have time. If you want to come in and suggest what you have in mind, but I agree with your sentiment that these pluralism of liberalism can be unstable at times. Adding a similar question, can we say the same with communists? So I would say no. I would say it depends how you want to parse that line between socialist and communist. I think that at the root of communism would be a suspension or just I don't think communism can take seriously the distinction between persons and protect individuals from collectivist pursuits and ambitions. And to that extent, I would call it an illiberal political movement. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm saying that it is on key points incommensurable, I think, with liberalism, though the devil would be in the details. And of course, liberal socialism would be trying to adapt the parts of communism, as it were, that could still fit with the preservation of individual rights and individual freedom. Alex, did you want to ask your question? I don't know how this works.
It's all, I think people have been asking, it's sort of circling the thing I had in mind, but it's because at the minute we are all as liberals at each other's throat. It's a very divided political climate. And it was interesting how you said, like, for instance, China's offering a spiritual enlightenment or instead of liberalism, and meanwhile we're all fighting amongst ourselves about what to do. And I feel there's a lot of there's such a splintering among liberals that I do feel like someone who's, say, a social democrat is just have completely different values to me. And it's interesting that, if you're saying we're all liberals to the core, there's such a lack of unity in that. Like there is it's a splintered cultural moment, and I'm wondering what to make of that.
I think
Not
you're
sure
right.
what the question is.
No, it's good. Okay, so first of all, I think you're completely correct that illiberal countries can kind of unify and collectivize in a way that is not just implausible for liberals, but impermissible for liberals. So China can do, the next book I want to write is called Politics and Soulcraft, and the way in which really powerful regimes step up and start to try to create a certain vision of subjectivity and the good life. And illiberal regimes, it's no fuss, no muss for them. They can do that. Liberal regimes cannot for its own internal commitments of pluralism and self-determination. So you're completely right on that. And it's something to talk about. The other one, I think it's a question. So I think that between these different versions of liberalism is it's a family quarrel. Let's put it that way. And I think that one of the works of political philosophy is to try to find underlying agreements as to which, say, you and a social democrat could go to a bar together, have a drink, and try to figure out exactly where it is you agree and disagree, and try to tone down the temperature on your disagreement and find commitments that you share in common that might be developed into a reconcilable version of your doctrines. It's not always going to happen. I don't have this Pollyanna version that we can all kind of hold hands and that'll work out. But it's important, I think, to turn down the temperature and try to see the specific points on which we disagree. I'll just say this very quickly because it was such an amazing moment for me. One of my favorite podcasts of all time was when this Patrick Deneen guy that I mentioned at the middle line presentation, this critic of liberalism, he thinks the whole thing should be kind of burnt to the ground. He was invited on the Ezra Klein show, who's a big podcast for the New York Times. Ezra Klein, kind of a centrist, lefty kind of liberal. And you're expected to be like the showdown. But Ezra Klein is such a persistent and wonky guy. Like in a sense, he's really into policy and specifics and details. And he kept on pushing Patrick Deneen to get past his rhetoric to like, okay, what are we really talking about? Where are we disagreeing? And at the end of the day, the differences between them were ridiculously minimal. It was like one of them thought that there should be divorce counseling subsidized on a national level, and the other should. And it was like, what are we talking about at the end of the day? So sometimes I think the disagreements can kind of magnify. Now, let me put it that way. But that's something, Alex, we could talk about offline. I'm sort of lost track to where I think I met.
The next question, Alex, is, in your opinion, which strand of liberalism has produced the best social outcomes when implemented by a state, like at least poverty, happiness, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, so I think the social democratic one, the more welfare-y one, I think is my favorite. It's the one that I think most consistently fleshes out what a liberal way of life means. I understand that's very disputable, but that's where I stand. And I also think it's stable in the way that perhaps some of the other strands are not, because everyone feels cared for and provided in some, maybe imperfectly, but in some measure, people feel buy-in to their society. So that's something I think is very interesting. A book I would recommend that's such an interesting book that got no airtime, but I just find fascinating, it has such a great title. It's called The Swedish Theory of Love. Check it out. Check out The Swedish Theory of Love. And it's about how Sweden, which seems like a totally lefty, socialistic kind of country, which it kind of is on the other hand, has all of these welfare and social provisions in order to basically allow individuals to be free, to be as self-determining as they can. What Swedes are really freaked out about is people being dominated by, not by their state, but by informal groups that they didn't choose. So kids being dominated by their parents, wives being dominated by their husbands, people being dominated by their employers. And so Sweden's welfare system is all about allowing kind of individuals to be as free as they can be. And that's interesting. So that's a way in which far left and kind of far right commitments can cohabit in an interesting way. Anyways, that's what's to that. Where am I, Jam? Sorry.
The next one is, how does liberalism proliferate in countries where there is strong collectivist culture? Is there a great historical example where liberalism championed despite such
I'd love to hear more what you think about that. I don't think it can take that much root. So, okay, collective. I don't think liberalism is about kind of freewheeling individualism. I think that at the heart of liberalism is a commitment to kind of generosity and to caring about each other's fate. So I don't think it's like radically individualist. I think that's a really poor vision of liberalism, and most often one just spoken by its critics to kind of like, this is straw man, is what I'm trying to say. But on the other hand, I think that if you don't have a culture in which individual self-determination is an important value, I don't think liberalism can take hold. So in strongly patriarchal, strongly hierarchical cultures, I don't think you can just beam liberalism in and it'll work. I think that that needs to develop organically from the desires of a citizenry themselves. So I think that, yeah, I'm very much not a proponent of exporting liberal democracy around the world, not just because I think it's immoral, I just think it's inexpedient as well. So that's what I would answer to that. It's a quick answer, but it's a very deep question you asked. I think
We just have one last question to ask. And it's the one asked by Albert Aguilar. He says, "Do you think that social liberalism is the best alternative to socialism?"
Yeah. let me add. Let me conclude unambivalently. Yeah, I'm more on the liberal side of the liberal socialism equation, but yeah, let's say that is yeah. So thumbs up. But let me here pass over to my fellow democratic liberal, as he's just outed himself for saying. So Alexandre Claudio, and I want to thank everyone for their terrific questions. Email me if you have another, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Alex, for answering the questions, and thank you very much for the audience for asking so many questions that are very interesting. So now we can move forward to our second speaker. Let me introduce Dr. Alexandre Claudio. So Dr. Alexandre Claudio is an intellectual and cultural historian of the Philippines with a broad interest in the history of global liberal thought. Dr. Claudio is an associate professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His book, Liberalism and Post-Colony, Thinking the State in 20th Century Philippines, received the 2019 George McTurnan Cahin Prize from the Association of Asian Studies and the 2019 European Association for Southeast Asian Studies Humanities Book Prize. He is also the author of a short book, Jose Rizal, Liberalism and the Paradox of Coloniality, which examines how turn-of-the-century liberalism informed the birth of Filipino literature and nationalism. Prior to his appointment at Berkeley, Dr. Claudio held teaching positions at Ateneo de Manila University and De La Salle University, and served as postdoctoral fellow at Kyoto University Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Additionally, as a public intellectual, he hosted a podcast titled Basaganang Trip and Rappler, facilitating discussions on sociology, history, and politics. So, Dr. Claudio.
Maraming salamat, Jam, and thank you very much to the FEF. I'm just going to try to share my screen. Okay. There you go. Thank you very much to Professor Lefebvre for that amazing presentation. I'm very, very excited to pick up the book. Actually, before this, I was looking through many of his interviews. I just got me even more excited to read the actual book. So let's jump straight in. I want to begin with definitions of liberalism that I think are useful for Filipinos. They don't necessarily come from Filipinos. I'm going to talk about definitions of liberalism that come from Filipinos. But I think these kind of four non-mutually exclusive definitions of liberalism work for us. The first one that I like, although it's a bit too broad for me, is Duncan Bell's summative approach to liberalism, wherein he just says, if an argument has been classified or recognized as liberal, it's liberal. So kind of super simple. But I think we need to nuance that a little bit. And I think there are three ways to sort of nuance that. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. One, Alan Ryan says that liberalism is an objection to all forms of absolute authority. And then there you get this notion of ordered liberty, which is a kind of constitutional liberalism that does not seek to protect the rights solely of people in a kind of individualistic sense, but also seeks to do that through a governmental or state framework, a kind of procedural liberalism that proceeds from the state. And then sort of in contrast to that is what I find really generative is this idea that Alex just mentioned of a comprehensive view of the good life, which he says is anchored on values of personal freedom, fairness, reciprocity, self-reflection, and irony. And I was actually thinking about what that means relative to my life. How has my life been bettered by liberalism on an everyday level? And I just recalled that I was a college debater, and sort of my core personality is that of an argumentative college debater. And my favorite friends are mostly my college debate friends. And I realized one of the reasons why we have such a good life when we drink together is we can argue without fighting. So, we will argue about something in pop culture. We'll argue about LeBron James versus Michael Jordan. We'll argue about markets. And sometimes we'll raise our voices. And then afterwards, nobody gets pissed. We cheers and we drink. and my sense is that only liberals can have that kind of fun, because other people would treat argumentation as fighting, but liberals don't. And that's kind of my idea. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but that's sort of my feeling of what a liberal way of life is. So I think those definitions are useful for Filipinos, but I'm a historian, and so I kind of want to approach this historically. And I wrote an article a couple of years back where I kind of divided the history of liberalism into 4 phases. 1, the anti-colonial phase; 2, the canon formation phase; 3, the state building phase; and 4, the intermittent anti-dictatorship phase. So jump straight in. The anti-colonial phase, roughly 1812 to 1902, and those dates are interesting because 1812 was the signing of the Cadiz Constitution in Spain. The Cadiz Constitution, Alex just mentioned this earlier, the modern usage of the word liberalism or liberalismo to refer to a political ideology begins in Spain, and it begins in 1812 with the Cadiz Constitution. And the Cadiz Constitution actually made its way to the Philippines, but by the time it made its way to the Philippines, it was no longer the law of the land in Spain. And I'm not sure about this, but I think I heard one historian say that when the Cadiz Constitution arrived in Cebu, it was received by an escribiente don't quote me on this, I have to confirm with my friend Mike Colonnane, but I think he said something to me that the Cadiz Constitution, when it arrived in Cebu, was received by a Cebuano scribe or escribiente by the name of Andres Duterte. This is no doubt the great or great grandfather of the most illiberal president in Philippine history. So the irony, of course. What was this liberalism like? This liberalism was a radical liberalism, because in a colonial context, of course, ideas such as liberalism become even more radical. If they're radical in a conservative Europe, they are even more radical in a conservative Catholic colonial state. And by definition, colonialism is a form of authoritarianism. So a Spanish diplomat in the mid-1800s, for example, said that in the Philippines, liberalism and rebellion are synonymous. And Rizal himself said that the reason why he became a liberal was because it was a radical idea. He made the argument that liberal and modern ideas are asphyxiated upon touching the shores of Manila. And in fact, this is crucial to note. We think of Rizal as the father of the Philippine nation, but if you look at his writings, it's very clear that he was a liberal first before he was a nationalist. What do I mean by that? Rizal's initial lobby was to make the Philippines part of Spain, part of Mother Spain. And as part of Mother Spain, Rizal believed that the Philippines should enjoy the rights that other parts of Spain had, like, for example, like, the Catalonians. So he believed that there should be freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But once he realized that those principles, or that those rights rather, would be systematically denied of Filipinos for as long as they were part of the Spanish Empire, he decided that the Philippines needed to be independent from Spain. And that's what we mean when we say liberal first before nationalist. So in that sense, Filipino nationalism is born in liberalism. It's essential to our DNA. And we know this because the Philippine Revolution of 1896 was the first, not just the first liberal revolution in Asia, it was the first liberal revolution in Asia, just like many other revolutions of that century, like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, right? Because the liberalism of this period was insurgent, it was radical. I know this is kind of hard to think about today because we think of liberalism as a kind of mainstream phenomenon, as a quiet phenomenon, as something done by people without chests. That's a term from Francis Fukuyama. But during this period, liberalism was romantic. It was revolutionary. And Rizal himself thought that liberalism in the context of the Philippines was actually more romantic, was actually more revolutionary, because he felt that if you were to be a liberal in the colonies, you had to suffer for it. Right? He believed that his liberal friends in Spain, the Spanish liberal Republicans, had it easy. They had freedom of the press relative to the Philippines. But in the Philippines, you not only did not have freedom of the press, you had a theocracy. So if you wanted to be a liberal in the Philippines, you had to suffer for your liberalism. And Rizal believed that liberalism was purified in the context of the colony. And that was sort of, I think, his interesting contribution to the history of liberalism. So, like, Why is liberalism a way of life in the West, for example? Partly because you can take it for granted. But in the context of the Philippines, where you have a very powerful Catholic Church, where you have authoritarians left and right, and where we're used to authoritarianism, liberalism is not a way of life, and to be a liberal means to suffer for your liberalism, right? And so I think that's one of the differences between a kind of liberalism that is taken for granted in Western liberal contexts and a place like the Philippines, a colony or a post-colony. So moving on to the second phase of liberalism, I call this the canon formation phase, 1902 to 1946. This is essentially the Philippines under American rule. So the interesting thing about Filipinos under American rule is that, of course, they had limited state power because the Philippines was still a colony, but they had growing discursive power because the language of American imperialism was such that they wanted to empower Filipinos to, quote unquote, speak for themselves. They were training Filipinos to be future administrators and leaders of their own independent nation. And what you got at this point was a kind of articulation of Spanish era liberalism with American civics. And in that sense, there's a kind of continuity between the Ilustrado politics of people like Jose Rizal, but I'm moving fast here, and I'm also assuming that folks know who Rizal is, folks know what Ilustrados are. I assume most people have taken basic Philippine history courses. So you get an articulation of Spanish era liberalism, the liberalism of Cadiz, which, by the way, I agree with Alex. The liberalism of that period was largely influenced by Montesquieu. It was a kind of liberalism that believed in the division of powers. But what you had with the arrival of the United States was notions of civics. In particular, during this period, a very influential liberal American author that was being read by many Filipinos was John Dewey, who believed in kind of progressive education, who believed that a liberal system could not exist without teaching your students the value of open-ended inquiry. So again, that's interesting because that's kind of liberalism as a way of life, if you think about Dewey. The other attribute of liberalism at this point was it further articulated itself with a kind of nationalism, in this particular case, a nationalist canon formation, which our national artist Rizal Mojares has referred to as Philippinism, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. Philippinism was a movement wherein Filipinos started to create secular symbols for the nation. So, for example, it was in the 1920s and 1930s that we decided that Rizal was our national hero. It was in the 1920s and 1930s that we decided, I think, that the Calabao would be associated with our nationalism. So, these symbols of Filipino nationalism. I think it was also during this period where we started saying that the mango was the most important fruit in the Philippines. This was the moment when we said that sipa was our national sport, even though everybody knows that basketball is our national sport, right? So as a result of Philippinism, you get the further nationalization of liberal symbols, like Rizal, for example, and ideas. It was also during this period, for example, where you had Moros talking about being part of a multicultural Philippines. They called themselves during this period Mohammedan Filipinos. Of course, that's a hopelessly outdated term, but it was a claim towards a multinational, rather a multi-ethnic Philippines. The third phase is the state building phase. This is 1946 to 1965. So essentially, the period of Philippine independence, 1946 until 1965, the election of kind of your first real illiberal president, Ferdinand Marcos. During this period, Filipino bureaucrats seek to create a procedurally liberal state. This is the ordered liberty that I was talking about earlier. And internationally, this is very interesting. Filipino liberals become international advocates of human rights. My favorite example here is Salvador P. Lopez, or SP Lopez. He's on the right there. Salvador P. Lopez became the chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. And in fact, the name will come to me, but one of the drafters of the UN Declaration of Human Rights referred to Salvador P. Lopez as the finest chair of the Commission on Human Rights we'd ever seen, ahead of Eleanor Roosevelt. And the reason why he said that was because SP Lopez was the commissioner, or rather the chair of the commission, who proposed a system whereby anybody in the world could petition the United Nations to look into human rights violations in other countries, the right to petition. And this is very interesting because when the commission in 2017, at that time it was already called the Council, wanted to investigate the crimes that Duterte was committing against Filipinos, Ernesto Abella, The spokesperson of Duterte said that the UN is imposing a foreign idea of human rights on the Philippines. What, of course, Mr. Abella didn't know was that that mechanism was not developed outside by non-Filipinos. It was, in fact, developed by Filipinos like Salvador Lopez. So anyway, with the enshrinement of a liberal state, now you get the freedom to think about liberal ethics. And I don't have time to kind of talk through this, but I just want to quote one of the most prominent literary critics of this period, Leopoldo Yabes, and this is how he thought about liberalism. This is how Yabes thought about liberalism. Let me quote him. He says, the secular tradition in the Philippines will derive its strength mainly from the part of the tradition of the nation that is liberal and democratic. And so long as this tradition is not completely cut off from the European American liberal tradition, and so long as this latter tradition remains dominant in the Western cultural system, there's hope that the secular intellectual tradition will gather greater strength as the Filipino people become more educated and enlightened and grow in greater and more widespread abundance in the material blessings of life. I'd love for the audience to compare this to really anti-European, anti-American sentiments and illiberal sentiments coming from the kind of hyper-nationalism that you get in the 1960s and 70s, which of course eventually feeds into a kind of cultural illiberal nationalist Maoism, as represented by Jose Maria Sison and the Communist Party of the Philippines. This is kind of language that we're no longer familiar with, this kind of embrace of a kind of admittedly Western cultural system, but attendant to that is the belief that that system can be localized. It is foreign today, but it was actually very common in the 1950s. I was reading my grandmother's MA thesis in psychology from the University of the Philippines, and she spoke like this as well. And in fact, I should have quoted her. The final phase, the intermittent anti-dictatorship phase. Liberals during this period, and I would argue we're still in this period because that there are still Dutertismo is still around. And of course, President Marcos is liberal in certain respects, but he also trades on sort of the liberalism of his father's legacy. What this period is a period when liberals react to budding authoritarianisms, Marcos and Duterte in particular. And it is a period where liberalism seriously has to contend with alternatives. Alternative, of course, of Dutertismo, the alternative of Ferdinand Marcos's New Society, and we can talk about what these are, these kind of populist authoritarian movements. We can sort of decode that in the Q&A. And this is also a period wherein a deep global South liberalism discovers that it is not so secure after all. What do I mean by this? If you look at the history of liberalism in the Philippines, the liberal bureaucrats and the liberal intellectuals, from people like Lopez, from people like Yabes, especially in the 1950s, they believed that the Philippine liberal tradition was secure. And that's kind of unique in the context of, I think, the global South. There were very few countries in the world where the intellectuals and the leaders of the country were willing to argue that their liberal tradition was secure and that it was a secure part of that country's nationalism. I think in that sense, the Philippines might only be comparable to India because they, in the mid-20th century, they also thought that their liberal tradition was secure. But of course, we discovered that it was not as secure, both in the Philippines and in India. Of course, you have the rise of Hindutva under the BJP, Modi's BJP in India. And of course, you have the rise of Dutertismo in the Philippines. And these are, of course, backlashes to liberalism, particularly liberal intellectuals and a kind of effete liberal governing class. And in both cases, these kind of populisms target not just liberals in government, but also liberals in universities, right? So, one of the main things, I don't think you'll understand Dutertismo if you don't understand its hatred for institutions like the University of the Philippines or Ateneo or the various Ateneos in the country. I don't think you can understand Hindutva or Modi if you don't take into account the fact that it is, vehemently against a kind of liberal class that was incubated in universities such as JNU or Jawaharlal Nehru University, right? We can talk about that later. So that's sort of my brief history of Philippine liberalism. I realize I'm moving really quickly here, but that's okay. I actually really wanted to talk to you and talk to Alex. So there will be some time for Q&A. But let me answer a couple of questions that was posed to me. The first question is, has liberalism in the Philippines been successful? And I'll answer it like a wishy-washy liberal. And the wishy-washy liberal, of course, always says yes and no. The liberal is not fond of absolutes. Yes, because liberalism, by virtue of liberalism, there is a decent blueprint for a non-racial secular society governed by elected civilians in the Philippines, right? And again, we shouldn't take that for granted. I think the DNA of Philippine nationalism is kind of nice. Like, just think about, I don't want to say nasty things about the Malaysians, but think about the essential DNA of Malaysian nationalism, which is essentially racialized, right? Malaysian nationalism views itself as a nationalism that is meant to look at society through the lens of race. It is meant to acknowledge racial difference. And in fact, there is a reason why the dominant party of Malaysia for almost the entire 20th century, or almost its entire existence, has been a racist party. Right? That's not the case with the Philippines. Or you can compare us, for example, to Thailand, which has periodic coups. Right? Thailand has periodic coups because there is no liberal culture in Thailand that guarantees a society governed by elected civilians. And then, of course, the major problem with Thailand, which we don't have, is, of course, the problem of royalty. There are less majeste laws in Thailand. And these are not incidental to the nationalisms of these particular countries. These are inherent to the nationalisms of these countries. The Philippines does not have that problem. So in that sense, because our country was imagined as a liberal country, we have a great DNA. That's why I always say we have a great DNA. It's a DNA we can definitely work with. You see it manifesting until today. We have a comparative openness to feminism, LGBT, and trans rights. And of course, now we're having a discussion about divorce finally in the Philippines. And, it's kind of ironic that I talk about the Philippines as a liberal country, and yet we're the only country in the world without a divorce law. And then you have people, in the Senate who are not very smart saying things like we should not have divorce because I have a good marriage, something Cynthia Villar said just recently. So that's the yes part. The no part is it hasn't been successful because there is a current mass detachment from liberal institutions, right? And Duterte is the perfect manifestation of this. Duterte was not just a rejection of the Liberal Party. And mind you, I actually didn't talk about the Liberal Party too much. I actually did not talk about the Liberal Party at all. Well, although I did, post a picture of a very prominent member of the Liberal Party. This is Chito Gascon over here, my favorite Liberal Party liberal. Where was I? Sorry, I got distracted there. Yeah, so I didn't talk about the Liberal Party, but because I think that the backlash is not just against the Liberal Party, it is against this kind of liberal democratic nationalism and liberal democratic culture, right? And it's all encompassing. One of the things I've had to deal with, for example, recently as a result of the Duterte backlash, is I've had to defend things as commonsensical as Rizal was a liberal. Right? People don't believe in the context of Dutertismo that Rizal was a liberal, even if Rizal stated it directly multiple times, right? But of course, because Rizal is essential to Filipino nationalism, there is a stake among the advocates of Dutertismo to argue that he was not a liberal. The other reason why I think liberalism has not been successful is because no economic system has bound Filipinos to the liberal state. What do I mean by that? Tony Jott, one of my favorite historians, he's a social democratic historian of Europe. He says one of the reasons why liberalism is so secure in places like Scandinavia is because the same liberal state that guarantees your freedoms, in other words, the same liberal state that guarantees freedom of the press, that allows you to speak, is also the same liberal state that provides you healthcare. Right? It's also the same liberal state that provides you free education. And I don't think Filipinos are going to be attached to liberal institutions in the liberal state until these liberal institutions provide for certain basic needs and provide for a kind of equal opportunity, right? And this is why I say I'm also a social democratic liberal, and why I argue that I agree with Professor Lefebvre that in fact social democratic liberalism is the most secure kind of liberalism precisely because it binds citizens to the liberal democratic state. The final thing I want to say, no, liberalism is is a way of liberal way of life is either the problem with the Philippines is that the liberal way of life is either unavailable, unappealing, or unintelligible to a majority of Filipinos. It's unavailable because much of kind of liberal discourse is frankly still in languages or in media that the average Filipino does not consume. I mean, one of the things that appeals to me and why I really want to read the book Liberalism as a Way of Life is because I hear that it goes into parks and recreation. It goes into popular culture. And much of that popular culture is, I think, still unavailable to a certain class of Filipinos who don't view themselves as kind of urbane enough to consume that kind of literature. And we have not kind of produced that same pop culture ourselves in the Philippines, with the exception, of course, of a couple of notable pop culture phenomena like the Eraserheads, whom I believe, the most important band ever in the Philippines, who I believe are actually fundamentally liberal, and we can have a conversation about that. Unappealing, right? For some of them, it's unappealing because there are other cultures to tap into, whether it be kind of like collectivist cultures, familial cultures, or religious cultures. Definitely, the Catholic Church is still very important in the context of the Philippines. Although I would argue that at certain junctures in Philippine history, the Catholic Church has supported liberal reform. Finally, some of it is unintelligible to a majority of Filipinos, right? So there's a kind of cultural disjunct there, which prevents kind of liberal way of life from being part of the daily fabric of Filipinos. Final question that was posed to me. Is liberalism still relevant? I think it is, and Duterte is the proof that liberalism is still relevant. And it's relevant for the poor. Why? There's a chapter in Rizal's Nolib Metangere called La Voz de Perseguido. The Voz de Perseguido, or the voice of the persecuted. And in that chapter, Elias, who is the main liberal in the novel, not Ibarra. Ibarra is not a liberal. We could talk about that later on. He argues that it is the poor who benefit the most from a liberal order, precisely because it's the poor who can be victimized by the police. Right? It's the poor who are subject to arbitrary arrest. It's the poor who have to who are most exploited by the friar orders, right? And that was a point that Rizal made over 100 years ago. But we saw that again in the case of Duterte, because who was dying because of a lack of liberalism? Who was dying because there was no rule of law? There were no checks and balances. It was the poor, right? So I think Duterte was the ultimate proof that we still need liberalism. Other reason why I think we still need liberalism, and somebody alluded to this earlier, there's still a noisy Maoist, authoritarian, totalitarian movement in the Philippines, and we need to offer alternatives. I know that in terms of its military capacity, the Communist Party of the Philippines has grown quite small. But in terms of how it influences the rhetoric of activism in the country, I think it probably, for a certain segment of youth, it's probably still the most influential. And it definitely offers a kind of way of life for many of them, which includes secrecy, skullduggery, underground movements that many youths find appealing, kind of fun. And frankly, this is the reason why we need a liberal revival in the Philippines, because every time a youth leader gets sent up to the hills to become a Maoist revolutionary and who gets killed as a result, breaks my heart. And I really do think there needs to be an alternative to that. Third reason why it's irrelevant: incremental change is safe. And I think this is sort of the lesson of the 20th century, that incremental change is the safest kind of change. Those people who tried to change things quickly killed a lot of people. And we know this in the context of Southeast Asia. The most grotesque examples, of course, are the Khmer Rouge. And then you have places like China as well, right? Great change is dangerous change. Incremental change is safe. And I think liberals do that well. Right? Liberals are good at the margins. And then finally, liberalism is relevant because, as Alex said, liberalism is like modular furniture. But the metaphor that's been used in the Philippines is that it's like a plant. It's a plant that never dies. And a plant that never dies means that you'll find that same plant in various places, and it will be planted again, replanted again. It will grow in different directions, but that plant will never die. And so we'll have use for it again. And I think I'm 5 minutes under time. I hope that's okay. I really wanted to take a lot of questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Leloy, for your great talk. Yeah, as you said, you're 5 minutes under time, so we'll be able to entertain more questions from the audience. So again, the floor is now open for your questions. Kindly type in your questions, or directly send them to me. Or if you want, you can also raise your hand and then mute, but wait to be recognized for your questions.
Oh, okay. It feels like many universities, university councils are dominated, at least vocally, by hardline leftists. For instance, a recurring theme in student rallies in UP today is the demonization of the US in the context of the South China Sea dispute or opposition to economic charter change. To what extent do you think this type of skepticism healthy, productive in Philippine discourse? I think various positions are productive, of course, and that's the liberal thing to say. But what hasn't been productive is I don't think we've had a kind of robust response to Marxism and Maoism and communism in the Philippines. And part of it is really because we can't name it. Right? We're not allowed to name it in the context of the Philippines because if we name what we're talking about, we get called red baiters. Abroad, it's red taggers, which is an only in the Philippines term, by the way. In the rest of the world, it's called red baiting. But in the Philippines, we call it red taggers. I guess it's more evocative. And so we can't develop a language of anti-communism because we're not allowed to name the communists or the Maoists in the Philippines. And one of the things I didn't talk about it in the history too much, but was anti-communism was kind of at the heart of Philippine liberal discourse in the 1950s and 1960s. And this was not a kind of McCarthyite anti-communism. This was a kind of liberal anti-communism that believed in arguing against the communists, not killing them, right? But of course, how do we argue against the communists if you can't even name the phenomenon, right? You have to call them national democrats. You need to call them the extreme left, right? You can't even name the phenomenon of Maoism and communism. And I think there's this, the French historian Francois Furet referred to a phenomenon called anti-communism. And Furet was, of course, a liberal. And by anti-communism, he meant that there's a discourse that pervades society wherein every critique of communism becomes equated with fascism. Because indeed, many anti-communists were fascists, but also many anti-communists were liberal, right? And so one of the things I think we need to recover is to embrace the kind of anti-communist liberalism of people like Salvador Lopez or Carlos P. Romulo in the Philippines. I think it's time for that, right? And it begins actually by calling the phenomenon by its name. We have a Maoist movement, and we need to really talk about it. Okay, sorry. There are more questions. What are the steps we can take to mobilize liberals in the Philippines? Notice a lack of visible liberal organizations for various segments of Filipino society. We perform so poor in gathering liberals compared to Marxists. Well, I would quibble with that a little bit because the Marxists are not that big, except they are prominent, they're noisy, and they have a long history, and they're kind of a unified movement. Whereas liberalism, they're scattered. There are various liberals doing many liberal things. It's not just, of course, the Liberal Party, right? I would argue, for example, that Akbayan, for example, which styles itself as a socialist party, is actually a liberal party as well, right? Because it's a liberal social democratic party. And of course, I am of the opinion that the truest form of liberalism, or the most effective, I don't want to say true because that's essentialist, the most effective form of liberalism is social democratic. So if you pull together these various liberal energies and tendencies, you really do have something that's kind of prominent. And I would say, what's the adjective I'm looking for? Verdant in the context of the Philippines. It's just that it's not labeled as such, and they're not grouped together. But I'm not, I'm not an organizer, so I struggle to answer the question of what we do. I am primarily a historian.
Leloy, there's a question by Shanil.
Sure.
What are practical ways for us to convince the people belonging to the lower income classes who have an affinity for authoritarianism to accept liberalism?
No, I don't think it's the lower classes actually who have an affinity for authoritarianism. I would quibble with that a little bit. So if you look at the data, who were the ones who voted for Duterte the most, it seems like they were the kind of lower middle class. And remember in 2016, there's a kind of great analysis by the political scientists Mark Thompson and Julio Tejanqui, who said that Dutertismo was partially a response to the fact that Noynoy Aquino had given extraordinary economic growth to the rich, and he had engaged in policies like conditional cash transfers for the very poor. And that left out a kind of lower middle class who voted for Duterte. And I think that's sort of the kind of anti-liberal that is sort of the class that mainly voted for Duterte, that became the base for Dutertismo. And I think this class is actually a very persuadable class, because I'll tell you like what this class was in 1896. This class in 1896, this lower middle class, they're new middle class. Some of them are college educated, but maybe they don't go to the top tier schools. And the equivalent of this lower middle class in 1896 were the bodegueros, escribientes, and the office workers of urban Manila. And the best example of that was Andres Bonifacio. So if you were, in terms of class, if you were to place Bonifacio in contemporary Philippines, he would be a kind of lower middle class Duterte voter. But of course, Andres Bonifacio became the leader of the first liberal revolution in Asia. So what happened to the lower middle class? And I want to say, and the answer is actually quite simple. No, Jose Rizal was friends with Andres Bonifacio. Jose Rizal invited Andres Bonifacio to meetings of the La Liga Filipina, right? There was a connection between your elite liberals like Jose Rizal and that kind of potent lower middle class. I don't really see that happening in the case of kind of like your pink titas of Manila, for example, right? I don't see that happening. So we can learn from Rizal here, right? I think Rizal knew that that class was kind of potent class and really cultivated that class. That was what La Liga Filipinas organization in the Philippines was all about. What are we looking at? Okay. Would you Kevin Patrick, would you consider the current administration liberal or authoritarian under the guise of being liberal? I'm not so it might be a controversial statement. I think that the Marcos presidency is as liberal as all the other post-EDSA presidents, right? So I think that all the post-EDSA presidents are liberal to some degree, with possibly the exception of Rodrigo Duterte, who is our mass murderer, first ever criminal against humanity. But I think Bongbong Marcos is comparable to Aquino, he's comparable to the early Arroyo period, he's comparable to Estrada, he's comparable to Ramos. He's a post-authoritarian president who ran under authoritarian nostalgia, right? So even if he ran under authoritarian nostalgia, and he definitely has an authoritarian base, a lot of people voted for him because they thought he would bring back authoritarianism. He has not governed as an authoritarian. And we knew that in terms of social policy, he was in many cases more liberal than the candidate of the Liberal Party, right? He was more open to abortion, for example, abortion rights, more than Leni Robredo was. So, if, for example, the divorce bill passes under Bongbong Marcos, then I would argue that that's sort of a great advancement for Filipino liberalism. Next question. How can liberalism reconcile the tension between promoting individual freedoms and addressing systemic inequalities, particularly in a society marked by deep-seated socioeconomic disparities and historical injustices? I think that's actually, for me, that's the best question, but that's also for me the easiest question to answer, because we know that when society becomes disillusioned with the liberal democratic state, they tend to vote for populists, and at worst, they vote for mass murderers like Rodrigo Duterte. So how do you fix that problem? You make them attached to the liberal democratic state. And how do you make them attached to the liberal democratic state? As I said earlier, you turn that liberal democratic state into the state that provides them healthcare, that provides them education, and that binds them to the liberal democratic state. Albert,
There are
Yes.
a few ones we missed above, but I can
Oh,
read them for
sorry.
you. The
Yes.
ones by
Sorry.
Cirilo Ramos says that
Yes. Yes. Yes.
how has
Please.
the rise of populist and authoritarian movements in the Philippines challenged the principles and effectiveness of liberalism, and what strategies should liberal advocates adopt to address these challenges and promote democratic resilience?
I want to be resilient about this again, which was the results insight was because liberalism is difficult in the post colony or in the colony, it gets purified by the experience of pain. And I would argue, of course, that kind of Duterte is the pain that purifies liberalism in the Philippines. You can be kind of very literal about this, or not very literal, but you can be very crass about how to explain this. Look at, for example, how the Liberal Party became a better Liberal Party when it was in opposition, right? When it was, one of the most ironic things about the Liberal Party is that people hate it most when it's in power, because when it's in power, it becomes arrogant. When it's in power, it attracts all of these what we call in the Philippines, right? Chaleco liberals, right? The people who put on the chaleco or the vest of the liberals simply because the Liberal Party is in power, right? But when Duterte became popular, many of those chaleco liberals removed their chalecos, right? And the Liberal Party became oppositional once again, right? And that sort of purified liberalism in a way. And this kind of mirrors what happened to liberalism under Marcos. Also, if you look at, for example, the liberals early on, from 65 to 69, the liberals were essentially, quote unquote, the liberals were essentially trying to launch a coup, a military or a communist coup against Marcos. Right? That was sort of the goal of people like Ninoy Aquino. It was only when Marcos had consolidated power that they actually developed a kind of language for liberalism and where they became more conversant with things like social democracy.
Lelo, there's one more question above. It's by Johann Sebastian. He says here that how would you see the degree of change of the economic charter change in the contemporary politics of the Philippines? People view it as a great change, which is why some of them are noisy about it. The cha-cha is a big change again. But the question is it really a big change or just part of an incremental change?
Yeah, I think it's an incremental change, and I think there have been other liberalizations of the economy that have happened without necessitating charter change. I put a gun to my head. I'll say, yeah, I'm in agreement. I'm okay with economic charter change. Do I think it's the most important thing? I don't think so. I think, for example, if you want to talk about economics, my current book is actually about the history of austerity in the Philippines. The kind of response to our crisis, our periodic crises, is really that we have not developed an export sector, right? And that's what we've never done. Many reasons for this, and I have had conversations, of course, with Mr. Chicamco about this. One of the reasons why we haven't developed an export sector is because we're like the Germans of Asia. We believe in a strong peso, right? We talk about the peso, the strength of the peso, as if it's the weather, right? You open your newspaper, you're like, oh my God, the peso dropped. You know, it's like it's the worst thing in the world. Or the peso dropped. Ano na mangyayari sa bayan ko? Sira na ang Pilipinas because the peso dropped, right? You know, so ideas like that, stupid ideas like that, the belief in a strong peso, for example, that prevents development of an export sector, right? Those are the kind of ideas that we need to be looking at. We need to be thinking about industrial policy. And that's you can have industrial policy without charter change, right? You need the state actually needs to be able to pick its champions the way I think Korea and Japan has, right? I'm a big developmentalist also, and I think developmentalism, social democracy, and liberalism are things that are not opposed to each other. Yeah, but again, gun to my head, sure, economic charter change, is it the most important thing? No.
Okay. So we still have at least 4 questions in the chat box. So is it okay for you, Lelo, if we extend a bit? So just
Sure.
we can
Yes.
accommodate. All right. So there's a question by Albert here. He says, so Bongbong Marcos Jr. is actually not gonna establish an authoritarian state, but just whitewash his father's legacy.
Yes. That's people are gonna hate me for this, but that's what I think. That's what I think. I don't think he's gonna establish an authoritarian state. I don't think he has I don't think he has an end game. I think his end game has already been achieved. You know, they are now part of the bien pensant again, right? They're now being feted and celebrated globally. His American friends love him again, right? The cool kids in the UN love him again, and they're now acceptable. They're no longer personas non grata in the international community. And that was the end game of this particular form of Marcos restoration, at least for Bongbong Marcos. For Bongbong Marcos, he has achieved what he said he would achieve, which is to restore his family name. And that's it, I think. He's not, is he going to be the best president? I don't think so. Is he an existential threat to the liberal democratic system of the Philippines the way Rodrigo Duterte was? Definitely not. This is not a guy who goes around telling people that his idol is Vladimir Putin.
All right. So actually there's someone who asked to be an anonymous who asked to be anonymous, so I can just read his question. He says that on the decline or failure of liberalism, especially in the Philippines, is the imperfections of how it was espoused in our institutions to be blamed. This is related to how Duterte used this narrative to convince people to abandon it. Would the situation have changed if only Philippines had a better way of upholding its values? Or was the decline of liberalism inevitable, considering there was a global trend?
Well, I don't know about inevitability. That's a really tough word. Maybe it was really bound to happen. I mean, if it happened in the United States, it was going to happen to the Philippines. If the United States had a Donald Trump kind of figure, right, and the Philippines is kind of like patterned in many ways after the United States. Or put it this way, a lot of people were saying that, you know, probably China had a hand in the election of Duterte. We don't have proof for that, right? But you know, it seems like they backed him, they really like him, and that they benefited greatly from him, and they would benefit from an election of another Duterte, right? And I'm not so incredulous about the fact that that China is involved in our politics, because if Russia can back Donald Trump, then certain and kind of corrupt United States institutions, surely China can back an authoritarian in the Philippines and corrupt our institutions as well. You're already seeing it by the amount of Chinese misinformation that's being circulated in the Philippines about the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea dispute. Right? So I don't know if it's inevitable, but definitely the world was shaping up in a way that was going to create something like that. Oh,
All right.
so
Yeah.
I want to take Alex's question. Well, there's a kind of slacker. So, a lot of it is in Tagalog, but so I'll refer to an English one so you can listen to it immediately. And if you enjoy it, I'll send you translations of the Tagalog ones. But I love Shake Your Head, which is a kind of slacker song from their original album called Ultra Electromagnetic Pop from 1993. Right? By the way, the Eraserheads were also named after, you know, maybe somebody that a movie that maybe liberals should think about as well. Eraserhead was a film by David Lynch. Oh, there's another question from Alex. He's in the USA, Catholic critics offer the most robust critique and positive alternative to liberalism. Has this type of criticism taken place in the Philippines? Well, because in the United States, your most prominent Catholic is Steve Bannon, and there are kind of Catholics like that in the Philippines. So, you know, Steve Bannon, or to a lesser degree, Amy Coney Barrett types of figures. But in the Philippines, you actually get a relatively more progressive Catholic church, a church that is more aligned with the Catholic Church of Pope Francis. So it's a different kind of Catholicism. And also, like historically, liberalism in the Philippines was born also within the Catholic Church. So the first liberal party of the Philippines, which was called, well, its youth wing was called La Juventud Escolar Liberal, or the Liberal Scholarly Youth. And it's and the main liberal party in the 1880s was called Comité Reformadores, and that had a church wing, and in the 70s as well, Philippine social democracy was very difficult to disentangle from Philippine Christian democracy. And in the context of Dutertismo, of course, it was the church that was the biggest critic of Duterte. So I think in the Philippines, liberalism and Catholicism have had a more congenial relationship. But there are, of course, flashpoint issues, and the flashpoints are always sex, so reproductive health, and now divorce.
There's a question here by Shanil again. He asks, can you suggest any other ideologically true liberal parties aside from the Liberal Party for us to join? And he says that he asks for forgiveness for being partisan on the question.
Well, I'll see. I can't answer it. I have to disclose. I'm not an active member, but I never quit Akbayan Citizens Action Party, and I vote for them. They're the party that I vote for, and when I vote for a senator, I always vote for Akbayan Senator Risa Ontiveros. So I can't answer that question without, of course, revealing my cards that I am a kind of non-active member of a political party in the Philippines that I view as a social democratic party, but also a liberal party. So, I'm not telling you to join Akbayan, but of course, this is my way of kind of just like not answering the question.
All right, so we have space for at least two more questions before we end. The second to the last one is, in the book Momentum, I think part of economic liberalism, which was promoted by FEF, was the removal of NFA's power to buy rice. The private rice sellers were allowed to buy and sell rice, but now the government is returning NFA's power. What went wrong with that? It's a question by Kevin Patrick.
Oh, no, that's not my expertise.
All right.
I'll have to punt with that. But you know, I like the fact that the government is engaged in disinflationary measures that are targeted at food. That's one thing I want to say. And if you give up on that, then there's something wrong. There's a problem with our survey methodology because, of course, our survey methodology, every time we do a survey of the needs of Filipinos, they always their most important need is cutting inflation.
Mhm.
And that's scary. That's actually a wet dream for a Republican or a wet dream for a German central banker, right? Knowing that the biggest concern of your public all the time, regardless of the circumstances, is always inflation. Well, of course, what that doesn't take into consideration is the fact that Filipinos are not against like core inflation. They're actually against food inflation, right? So the central bank is such a conservative central bank in the Philippines. It's always engaged in disinflationary measures, and it justifies it by saying that Filipinos care about inflation the most. So it's going to engage in kind of aggressive interest rate hikes, right? Because it justifies it by saying Filipinos are anti-inflation. Actually, Filipinos are anti-food inflation. And you can, of course, the economists here know that you can disentangle that from the core inflation that the central bank is concerned with. And so this is my way of saying that any policy that makes the prices of food higher um, is problematic for me. Because it then justifies all sorts of like repressive, not repressive, but economically backward actions on the part of institutions like the central bank.
So this is our last question from Albrave. I think he says, it's a bit of a tangent, but what can we do about the threat advanced generative AI might pose to Filipino liberalism? Do you have any thoughts on this, Leloy?
Uh not my expertise, but I mean it is scary how quickly it can produce and reproduce fake news, right? And that's going to influence our elections, our next few elections. We were of course ground zero for misinformation during the Facebook era, and I wonder if we're going to be ground zero again for misinformation. I think that liberalism, of course, relies on a kind of relationship with the truth, right? And that's why liberalism is very uncomfortable with certain kind of post-structural ideas, which do not accept that there is such a thing as truth. Liberalism is ultimately an enlightenment philosophy and believes it can
Yeah.
improve things through a kind of interpretation of fact and truth. And of course, if AI precludes us from discovering the truth, then you do put yourself in a kind of more hyper real situation or a kind of hyper real society that is very difficult for liberals to negotiate, right? And I think people who are we know Putin's relationship with this information is very interesting because he has a kind of philosophical relationship to it, right? Because he does not believe in truth, right? He does have some post-structuralist philosophers, illiberal post-structuralist philosophers who are part of his ideological machinery, right? And so if we give up on truth and if we fall into the kind of relativism that fake news, but also kind of post-structural philosophy advocates, then that's going to be very difficult for liberalism.
All right. Thanks so much, Leloy, for your time answering the questions. And thank you everyone for posing your questions. This marks the end of our question and answer portion with Leloy. All right. So thank you very much, Leloy and Alex, for your talks. It was absolutely wonderful having you here today. Unfortunately, this ends our conversation on liberalism, at least for today. Again, we would like to thank everyone for attending. And we would like to thank our partners at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and again, also our sponsors, the universities that partnered with us.